Have you ever wondered why the more you try to get close to someone, the more they seem to slip away from you? Why silence grows louder when you try to fix things? And why your effort, your attention, your presence sometimes creates distance instead of connection? This is the truth most people don't want to hear because it challenges everything we believe about love, effort, and emotional connection. We are taught that if something matters, we should fight for it. We should explain more, care more, show up more. But human psychology is not always that simple, and emotional behavior does not always respond to effort the way we expect it to. There are people who do not move closer when you approach them. Instead, they retreat, not because they do not feel anything, but because something inside them becomes overwhelmed when emotional closeness increases. And in that moment, their mind does not interpret love as safety. It interprets it as pressure. This is where the paradox begins. The same presence that feels comforting to one person can feel suffocating to another. The same message that brings reassurance to you can create internal tension in them. And the same emotional effort that you believe will strengthen the bond can actually activate their need to withdraw. This is not about good people or bad people. It is about nervous systems responding differently to emotional intensity. Some individuals carry what psychology calls an avoidant attachment pattern. This does not mean they do not want connection. It means closeness can trigger an internal alarm system. When emotional intensity rises, their mind shifts into protection mode. Instead of leaning in, they step back. Instead of opening up, they close down. Not because they are trying to hurt you, but because their system is trying to feel safe again. And here is where most people get stuck. You start to believe distance is rejection. Silence feels like punishment. Reduced attention feels like loss. So you try harder, you reach out more, you explain more deeply, you become more available, more patient, more understanding. You think that if you just prove your care in the right way, the distance will disappear. But what you are actually doing, without realizing it, is increasing emotional pressure in their internal world. And pressure for someone who is already overwhelmed by closeness does not create comfort. It creates escape. This is the truth you don't want to hear. Sometimes, the more you pursue, the more you activate the exact behavior you are trying to stop because human psychology is deeply protective. When someone feels emotionally crowded, even unintentionally, their instinct is not to explain themselves. Their instinct is to create space. Space is not always rejection. Sometimes it is regulation. It is the mind trying to breathe again. And yet, from your side, that space feels unbearable. It feels confusing. It feels unfair because your emotional system works differently. You believe connection is built through presence, through consistency, through staying close. But not every nervous system reads closeness as comfort. This is why relationships can become painful without anyone being wrong. Two people can genuinely care and still trigger each other's defense systems. One moves forward, the other moves back. One reaches, the other withdraws. And both feel misunderstood. The hardest part is that your effort comes from love, but it lands as intensity, and their distance comes from self-protection, but it lands as indifference. So, you keep asking yourself, what more should I do? But the real question is not what more you should do. The real question is whether your doing is aligned with how the other person's emotional system actually functions. Because if someone's mind associates closeness with pressure, then more closeness will not create bonding. It will create withdrawal. This is the part where most people miss the deeper pattern. They think love is about closing distance, but in some cases love is about respecting distance long enough for the nervous system to reset. And here's something most people never realize until much later. When you stop chasing, something unexpected often happens. The emotional pressure disappears, the internal alarm quiets down, and only then can clarity begin to return. That is why this topic is not just about relationships. It is about emotional intelligence. It is about understanding that connection is not only built through approach, but also through timing, space, and psychological safety. Now, before going deeper into why avoidant people respond this way and what actually happens in their mind when you leave them alone, there is something important you need to understand about your own emotional wiring too, because the pain you feel in this dynamic is not random. It is rooted in your own attachment needs, your own expectations, and your own belief about what love is supposed to look like. And if you stay with this, you will start to see something very uncomfortable, but very real. Sometimes the truth that hurts the most is the truth that finally sets you free. What makes emotional distance so powerful is that it is rarely random. It is not simply a lack of interest, and it is not always a decision made with logic. In many cases, it is an automatic response shaped by deeper patterns that were formed long before the present moment ever arrived. To understand this, you need to look beyond behavior and focus on the internal experience behind it, because on the surface, it may look like someone is pulling away from connection, but internally, something very different is happening. The mind is trying to restore balance. For some individuals, closeness does not feel like comfort at first. It feels like intensity that rises too quickly. When emotional proximity increases, their internal system begins to register it as a form of pressure, not because the other person is doing something wrong, but because their body and mind interpret emotional exposure as something that needs to be managed carefully. This response is often rooted in early experiences where emotional availability was inconsistent. When a person grows up in an environment where closeness is unpredictable, the nervous system learns to stay alert. It learns that too much dependence can lead to discomfort or disappointment. So over time, independence becomes a form of protection. As a result, emotional distance becomes a familiar state. It is not chosen consciously in every moment. It is activated automatically when the feeling of closeness crosses a certain internal threshold. That threshold is different for everyone, but once it is reached, the system reacts. At that point, the mind shifts its focus. Instead of moving toward connection, it begins to prioritize control and emotional stability. Thoughts may become quieter, communication may slow down, and engagement may reduce. From the outside, it looks like withdrawal. From the inside, it feels like recovery. This is why pressure, even when it comes from care, can create discomfort because pressure removes the sense of emotional autonomy. And for someone whose system values independence as safety, losing that sense of space can feel unsettling. There's also another layer to this response. Emotional closeness increases vulnerability, and vulnerability requires trust, consistency, and internal readiness. When those elements feel uncertain, the mind may choose distance as a way to prevent emotional overload. This is not about rejecting connection. It is about pacing it in a way that feels manageable. The nervous system has its own rhythm. When that rhythm is disrupted by too much emotional demand, it naturally seeks equilibrium by stepping back. What often gets misunderstood is the difference between emotional capacity and emotional interest. Someone can care deeply and still withdraw. They can feel attachment and still create space. They can value connection and still feel overwhelmed by its intensity. This contradiction confuses people who expect consistency in emotional expression. But human behavior is not always consistent when internal regulation is involved. A person may move closer when they feel grounded and move away when they feel flooded. The connection itself is not rejected. The intensity of the moment is what becomes difficult to process. This is why emotional distance should not always be interpreted as a final answer. In many cases, it is a temporary adjustment. The mind is attempting to reduce stimulation so it can return to a state where interaction feels safe again. However, there is an important emotional dynamic that happens on the other side. When someone notices distance, uncertainty begins to grow. The mind tries to fill the gap with meaning. Questions appear, doubt increases, effort intensifies, not because of desperation, but because uncertainty is uncomfortable for the human brain. The brain is wired to seek clarity. When clarity is missing, it creates scenarios to regain control of understanding. This is where emotional pursuit often increases. More messages, more explanations, more attempts to reconnect. The intention is stability, but the impact can sometimes add more intensity to the situation. And when intensity rises again, the cycle repeats. One system seeks space, the other seeks closeness. One regulates through distance, the other regulates through engagement. Both are trying to feel secure, but in opposite directions. What makes this pattern so challenging is that neither side is intentionally causing harm. Both are responding to internal emotional needs. One is protecting independence, the other is protecting connection. And when these needs are not aligned, misunderstanding becomes inevitable. Over time, this creates emotional confusion. One person feels pursued and pressured. The other feels ignored and uncertain. Both experience emotional discomfort, but for different reasons. And without awareness, each reaction strengthens the other's response. The key to understanding emotional distance is realizing that it is not a fixed identity. It is a state, a response, a regulation mechanism. It can increase or decrease depending on emotional conditions, trust levels, and perceived safety within the interaction. When the nervous system feels safe, closeness becomes easier to tolerate. When it feels overwhelmed, distance becomes necessary. This shift is not about logic. It is about emotional survival patterns that operate beneath conscious awareness. Once you begin to see this clearly, the meaning of distance changes. It stops being a simple sign of rejection and starts becoming a signal of internal processing, a pause instead of an ending, clears throat, a reset instead of a closure. And this understanding becomes important because it changes how you respond. Instead of reacting to distance with urgency, you start to recognize the role of space in emotional regulation. Instead of increasing pressure, you begin to see the value of allowing equilibrium to return naturally. But even with this awareness, there is still a deeper psychological layer that most people miss. Because what happens after space is created often reveals more truth than the distance itself ever did. And that is where the next part becomes crucial to understand, because it explains what actually happens when emotional pressure is removed completely, and why silence can sometimes change the entire direction of connection in ways people do not expect. What most people never expect is that silence changes the emotional system in ways constant effort never can. When interaction stops or becomes minimal, something subtle begins to happen inside the person who previously felt overwhelmed. The internal alert system that was active for some time slowly begins to settle, not because feelings disappear, but because stimulation decreases. The mind is no longer processing repeated emotional input, so it starts to return to a more balanced state. At first, there is usually relief, not relief from a person, but relief from intensity. The absence of repeated emotional signals gives the internal world space to stabilize. Thoughts become less reactive. The sense of being emotionally crowded begins to fade. This creates a quiet environment inside the mind where reflection becomes possible again. In this quieter state, perception starts to shift. What once felt heavy or difficult to process no longer feels the same. Without constant emotional demand, the system is no longer in defense mode. Instead, it begins to reorganize experience in a calmer way. This is where understanding can slowly return, not through pressure, but through absence of it. Another important change happens at the level of attention. Human attention is naturally drawn to what is no longer present. When something or someone is consistently available, the mind tends to adapt and normalize it. But when availability decreases, awareness begins to sharpen. The brain starts noticing the gap, not immediately with emotion, but first with curiosity. This curiosity is not emotional attachment at first, it is cognitive recognition. The mind starts asking questions without even realizing it. Why is the pattern different now? What changed? Why does it feel quieter than before? These questions are not always conscious, but they begin forming the foundation for renewed mental focus. As time continues without repeated emotional input, another process begins to activate. The internal system starts reassessing significance. When something is constantly present, its importance can become background noise. But when presence is removed, its value often becomes clearer in hindsight. This is how human perception naturally recalibrates. There is also a psychological mechanism connected to autonomy. When emotional interaction becomes too intense, a person may feel their sense of control is reduced. Once that intensity is gone, autonomy feels restored. And when autonomy is restored, emotional resistance often decreases. The mind no longer feels it needs to defend itself, which allows openness to return gradually. This is not a sudden change. It is a slow internal adjustment. The absence of demand allows the system to breathe again. And in that breathing space, emotional clarity begins to form without external influence. What was once processed through reaction is now processed through reflection. At the same time, memory begins to play a different role. Instead of reacting to recent intensity, the mind starts accessing earlier impressions. Moments that were previously overshadowed by emotional overload start resurfacing, not as urgent thoughts, but as quiet recollections. And these memories often feel different when they are no longer mixed with immediate pressure. This is where emotional meaning can start to shift. Without ongoing stimulation, the mind has space to separate experience from reaction. It can begin to distinguish between discomfort caused by intensity and genuine connection that may have been present underneath it. This separation is important because it allows more balanced interpretation of past interaction. Another subtle effect occurs through contrast. When constant interaction is removed, the difference between presence and absence becomes more noticeable. The mind begins to compare emotional states, what it felt like when engagement was frequent versus what it feels like now. This contrast naturally highlights what has changed, and change draws attention. Attention, once activated in this way, often leads to reconsideration, not because someone is trying to return, but because the mind is re-evaluating emotional relevance. Humans are wired to reassess what feels uncertain, and absence creates uncertainty in a way that presence rarely does. During this phase, emotional resistance can also soften. The protective layer that was previously active begins to relax because there is no longer anything to defend against. Without repeated emotional input, there's nothing triggering the same level of internal guarding. This creates a space where openness can slowly rebuild itself. However, this does not guarantee action. It simply creates possibility. The mind becomes more receptive but still cautious. Awareness increases, but expression may still remain controlled. This is why the shift is often internal before it ever becomes visible externally. What matters most in this process is timing. Emotional systems do not change on command. They adjust through rhythm, space, and recalibration. When that rhythm is no longer disrupted, balance can return naturally. And when balance returns, perception changes with it. This is where most people misunderstand silence. They interpret it as absence of progress. But internally, silence is often where the most important processing happens. It is where emotional noise reduces enough for real understanding to begin forming again. And as clarity slowly returns, the mind begins to reassess what matters, not based on pressure or urgency, but based on stability. What felt overwhelming before may now feel manageable in memory. What felt confusing may now feel more structured in understanding. This is the quiet transformation that happens when emotional intensity is removed from the equation. Nothing dramatic on the surface, but significant changes underneath. The system that once reacted begins to reflect. The mind that once resisted begins to reconsider. And the emotional state that once felt restricted begins to open again at its own pace. But even at this stage, another deeper layer exists. Because once clarity starts forming, the next question naturally arises inside the mind. What does this connection mean now when the intensity is gone and only understanding remains? And that is where the next shift begins, because it reveals how value, memory, and emotional interpretation evolve when the mind is no longer under pressure, but fully aware of absence and presence at the same time. When the mind reaches a calmer state after emotional intensity has faded, something deeper begins to unfold. It is no longer about relief or distance, it becomes about meaning. The internal system starts asking a different kind of question, one that is not driven by stress, but by reflection. What did that connection actually represent? This is where emotional processing moves into a more conscious layer. The person is no longer reacting to pressure or stimulation. Instead, they are evaluating experience from a quieter mental space. In this state, judgment becomes less defensive and more observational. The absence of noise allows details that were previously ignored to come forward. One of the first things that emerges is comparison between emotional states. The mind begins to contrast how life felt during engagement and how it feels during separation. This comparison is not always intentional. It happens automatically because human memory is structured around change. Difference creates awareness, and awareness creates evaluation. In this evaluation, emotional memory plays a significant role. The brain does not store experiences as isolated events. It stores them with emotional tags. When those tags are revisited without current pressure, they often feel different than they did in the moment. What once felt overwhelming may now feel less intense. What once felt confusing may now appear more understandable. This shift in perception is important because it allows emotional reinterpretation. The mind starts separating reaction from reality. It begins to identify which parts were driven by internal overwhelm and which parts were based on genuine connection. This separation helps reduce internal conflict and create space for clear understanding. As this process continues, Curiosity becomes more structured. It is no longer random questioning, it becomes focused reflection. The mind begins exploring meaning, not just events. Why did certain moments feel impactful? Why did others feel distant? What patterns can be recognized when emotion is no longer clouding judgment? This type of reflection often leads to recognition of value that was previously overlooked. When something is constantly available, its significance can become normalized. But when it is no longer present in the same way, the mind starts to reassess its importance. Absence creates contrast, and contrast brings clarity. However, this does not mean emotional attachment automatically returns in the same form. Instead, what often develops is a more balanced awareness. The intensity of reaction decreases while understanding increases. The mind is no longer operating from urgency. It is operating from observation. In this stage, emotional resistance also changes shape. Earlier, resistance was active and protective. Now it becomes softer and less rigid. This happens because the internal system is no longer responding to immediate pressure. Without that pressure, there is less need for defense and more capacity for consideration. At the same time, the concept of control becomes more visible internally. When emotional interactions were intense, there may have been a sense of losing balance or autonomy. With distance, that sense of control gradually returns. And when control returns, emotional openness often follows in a more natural way. This does not mean decisions are made quickly. In fact, the opposite is often true. The mind becomes more careful, not less. It begins to weigh emotional experiences with greater attention. It no longer reacts impulsively. It reflects before forming conclusions. Another important shift occurs in how connection is interpreted. When intensity is removed, the mind starts to evaluate whether the connection felt safe, consistent, and manageable. These qualities become more noticeable in hindsight. What was once experienced as emotional pressure may now be seen as imbalance in pacing rather than lack of care. This change in interpretation is subtle but powerful. It allows the mind to reframe past interaction without emotional distortion. Instead of viewing everything through the lens of discomfort, it begins to recognize complexity. Both positive and challenging elements can be acknowledged at the same time. As this balanced awareness develops, emotional distance is no longer the dominant focus. It becomes part of a larger understanding of how the interaction unfolded. The mind is no longer stuck on absence. It is integrating the entire experience into a more complete picture. This integration is what leads to emotional maturity in perception. The person is no longer trapped in reaction cycles. They are processing experience with greater depth. And in this depth, clarity becomes more stable. It is not dependent on presence or absence anymore. It is built on understanding. However, even in this state of clarity, there is still a quiet emotional undercurrent. It is not urgency and it is not confusion. It is recognition. The mind recognizes that certain experiences had significance, even if they were complex. This recognition does not demand action. It simply exists as awareness. What makes this stage unique is that emotional interpretation becomes self-contained. It is no longer influenced by immediate interaction. It is shaped by internal reflection. And this internal reflection is what gives it stability. At this point, the emotional system has moved through multiple phases, from intensity to withdrawal, to silence, to reflection, and now to understanding. Each phase serves a function in recalibrating perception. Nothing is wasted. Everything contributes to rebalancing how connection is understood. And yet, there is still a deeper psychological layer beneath this awareness. Because even after understanding forms, the mind continues to explore one final question quietly in the background. How should this insight influence future emotional choices? That is where the final transformation begins, where awareness becomes direction and where emotional experience turns into long-term behavioral change.